The pine woods beyond the southern villages of Nordheim stood as they had stood for 10,000 winters. Black columns rising into a gray sky, snow falling slow and constant between them. The silence of a country that had heard no human voice in days. Then the air at the tree line bent. The snow that should have fallen through the space ceased to fall through it. A seam opened where no seam belonged, and out of the seam came a man who was no longer a man. And the snow began again behind him, and the seam closed, and the forest forgot it had ever been opened. He carried 2 axes wreathed in a flame that gave no light and shed no warmth. The runes burned faintly at his brow. The snow beneath his boots did not melt. He stood at the edge of the trees and looked south, and what was in his face was neither hate nor hunger, nor anything a living man could name. Only the flat patience of an instrument that has been set down where its work begins. Humankind is a kind of disaster. It calls upon itself the greater part of its own sorrows by deliberate hand, driven by the small ambitions of small men, by the pride of chiefs, by the greeds of merchants, by the silences of those who knew and did not speak. And what it sows in the years of its plenty, it reaps in the years of its undoing. The harvest is always its own. The blade is always its own. The blood that runs in the snow when the reckoning comes was drawn from a vein the harvester opened himself generations before. In some hour he is long forgotten. And yet, the things that live beyond the veil hold no preference in the matter. They do not weigh the deeds of men. They do not measure the chiefs against the shepherds, the cruel against the kind, the watchman who slept against the watchman who held. To the thing that comes through the seam, a child of the hearth and a king on his throne are the same body of work. Bone and breath and warmth to be taken, and a face to be worn afterward in the long march toward whatever the seam was open to reach. The veil thins because the watch fails. The watch fails because men forget. Men forget because the years are long and the cold is far away. And the chiefs who remembered have been dead for 10 generations, and the chiefs who came after them did not ask, and the chiefs who came after those did not know there had ever been a question. The disaster of the human is in the forgetting. face of darkness had risen out of a place where despair keeps its hall. A hollow under the world, a vacuum that is not absence but appetite, that breathes without lungs and waits without time. Word of it came south on the iron coasts before the snow of that year had begun in earnest. A high chief of the North Fjord clans, with his thanes and his Seeress folk, rode down from his steading to rally the southern Vanir villages, to call the holdfasts to muster, to set the war horns sounding from steading to steading along the cold shore, that the clans of Vanaheim might gather under one banner against whatever thing had stirred in the dark places of the north. He did not find what he had ridden to find. What he found, where the pine forests of the southern fjords gave way to the long white country that runs down to Cimmeria, was a sea of the dead. They came in no order any war chief had been taught to read, not in shield wall, not in wedge, not in the loose murderous swarm of a Vanir raid coming down on a southern village. They came as a tide comes, without thought, without weariness, without the small hesitations by which living men betray themselves before a charge. The frost-rimmed faces of warriors 10 winters in their barrows, the smaller shapes of children long laid in the cairns, women whose mourning songs the seeresses themselves had sung, walking now in the company of the men who had buried them. Whole steadings emptied of their dead and set marching, and the snow falling on them and not melting, and no breath rising from any mouth in all that host. And the marching was south, not north, south. Not toward the warm lands the Vanir had hungered after for 1,000 winters. Not toward the granaries of Nemedia, nor the soft cities of Aquilonia, of which the skalds sang in the long dark of midwinter. The dead host did not march where the living Vanir would have marched. It moved as a thing moves that has been called, as iron moves toward the lodestone. And what called it lay beyond the pine country, beyond the moors, in the black hill country where the children of Crom keep their silent steadings. The dead were marching upon Cimmeria. There is a sight that in the history of a people of a place, only one generation in all the long roll of generations is ever cursed to see. A sight the fathers have not seen, and the sons will not see. A sight the skalds set down in the deep verses that are sung once in 100 winters and never explained to the children. The Northmen on that ridge were that generation. They were looking upon the thing the verses had been kept for. "Black Emir," the High Chief said, and his voice was the voice of a man who has used the name of his god and found the name no shelter.
"The gates of hell have opened,"
the seeress said beside him, and she did not say it as a cry. She said it flat, the way a woman names a thing she has lived 60 winters preparing to name, and would have given those 60 winters not to have to name at all. The High Chief looked upon the host, and knew the muster he had ridden to raise would never be raised. His thanes turned their horses without command. The seeresses who had spoken with the things that live behind the wind, and had thought themselves hardened to every shape of dread, would not afterward speak of what they had seen in that hour. And 2 of them did not speak at all again in any matter until the year they died. They rode north. They rode back through the villages they had passed in the going, and at each village they cried out what was coming, and the steading folk did not at first believe them, and then believed them, and the work of the barricades began. Axe and timber, stone rolled against the gateposts. The old men brought out blades that had hung above the hearth since the wars of their grandfathers. The seeresses burnt the herbs that had not been burnt in the memory of any living man, and chanted the chants that had been kept for the ending of the world. And the werefolk among them put on the skins their fathers had forbidden them to wear, and stood the watches at the palings with eyes that did not blink. They did not march to meet what was coming. There would be no meeting it. They drew themselves into their holdfasts as a hand draws into a fist, and they barred the doors of their steadings against the dark, and they waited to see whether the tide that moved south would, in its passing, find them, or whether the thing that had called it had use only for the hill country of Crom, and would let the fjord stand. And yet, to the eye that watched them long enough, the tide was not the tide it had at first appeared. The dead did not move in the manner of the mindless. The mindless stumble. The mindless break ranks against a stone and forget what they were walking toward. These did not. These walked as men walk who have been given a road and a reason, and who carry the road and the reason in them as a horse carries a rider. Something was in them. Something rode them as a rider rides, and turned their heads when the path forked, and set their feet upon the southward way without confusion and without rest. The shamans on the ridge saw it before the warriors did. The shamans understood what they were looking at. Not a corpse tied loose upon the snow, but a host inhabited. 400 bodies of the long-buried Vanir, and behind every dead face, the small, dark passenger of a purpose that was not the dead man's own. The snow fell on the barricaded villages. The dead in the south marched on.